First, I would like to welcome everyone to our Autodesk webinar series. Today, we're going to talk about EAGLE manual routing and its capabilities. We'll be explaining the basic concepts of manual routing and demonstrating some different aspects that we currently have implemented. Let's talk about our agenda today. Why not use the auto router? It's actually a lot easier to use the auto router because it gets done for you. We'll talk about that topic on one of my slides. Also, we'll talk a little bit about manual router versus auto interactive routing. Okay? And we have some of our legacy users here that will clearly see the difference about manual routing and auto interactive routing. And then after that, we'll go live with EAGLE as well. Now, let's talk about the auto router versus manual routing. You know, when you're doing some auto routing, you're not in control of what's going to happen on the board. It just does it and gives you those results. George, do you have any comments about using the auto router? What are the benefits, or maybe there are no benefits on the auto router? Tell us a little bit of what you think about the auto router.
If I tell everybody what I think about the auto router, we'll be here a lot more than 30 minutes. No, in all seriousness, people tend to look at an auto router as a panacea, especially new users. They think, oh, it'll do everything for me, and try to call it a day there. The auto router is a tool, like a hammer, like a knife, like anything else of that nature. In order to really take advantage of what it can do for you, you have to know when it applies, when you can really use it. So letting the auto router just go to town on a board is usually not going to give you the best results. Normally, what I like to use the auto router for is for doing straight drops to ground and power planes. In that scenario, it really does save work. It just goes right off the pad, drops a via, and takes care of all that for me, and then I can do some of the other traces more carefully. Additionally, usually when at least in the EAGLE, when working with EAGLE, the auto router won't touch anything that's pre-routed. So the general workflow we recommend is do anything that's a critical trace manually first. Save your board. That way, if you need to undo or whatever, you can always return to that state where you finished your manual routing, and then you can let the auto router finish off the less critical traces. So, how do you define a critical trace? Well, basically, if a trace is going to be susceptible to, for example, EMI, if it's going to be carrying high current, if it's carrying very low-level signals, like anything EKG, anything medical, anything that's low-level analog in general, that's something you need to protect. You need to route in a careful way. So anything that requires careful attention when routing, those things you want to do manually first. Then you can let the auto router kind of finish off the stuff that's less important. So those are my thoughts on it. It's a tool. It's not going to do your job for you, because if it could do a good job, then nobody would pay you to do it. So just keep that in mind. Use it where it makes sense. Use it where it can really have a benefit for you. It's not the devil. It's not, I don't subscribe to the idea that you should never use an auto router. No, it's a tool, and it has scenarios where it is useful, where it can be effective for you. But you can't just blindly go in there and expect it to do all your work for you. That's just not going to fly. So those are my 2 cents.
Thank you, George, for that. Greatly appreciate. Now, a little story here. I was once at a trade show, and a teacher approached me and let us know that their students are fully prohibited from using the auto router. And he actually knew the auto router well enough. He had a technique that if he actually looked at the board, he knew if they were using it or not. So I thought that was kind of funny. Anyway, let me go to my next slide, because I wanted to provide a slight difference. That way, our users would have an idea of what manual routing and interactive routing meant. So So in the past, we only had a manual router. Many of you may remember our manual router. Basically, yes, would plow. You would move your trace, and it would just plow through anything. It would not really take into consideration its surroundings. It would just go through right. There's a pad there. There's a trace there. It didn't really matter. It would go right through it. It would provide you absolutely no assistance at all. Interactive routing basically means that it's providing you many levels of assistance. And that's what has happened in EAGLE version 9. As you could see on my GIF file, it can provide you real-time DRC. It will actually avoid what we call obstacle avoidance. And then we also have push and shove, which is only some of them that we'll be demonstrating today. So I just wanted you to be able to have an understanding what is the difference between the manual routing and interactive routing. So, I'm going to go ahead and leave it here because I'm going to do our best to keep it within the 30 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and pass the ball over to Jorge. So I'm going to mute myself and unmute Jorge.
Cool. Caught the ball. Let's see now if I can share my screen. Yours is still being shared, Ed. Okay, I'm the presenter now. So, okay, cool. Let's click over here. Share screen, and hopefully everyone can see my screen.
I see it.
You see it? Cool. So let's bring up EAGLE. So I'm going to show, this is one of our example boards that comes with EAGLE. This is the launch pad. And I want to highlight a couple of things with routing and even a couple of other tools that can make routing easier. So besides the routing tools that I was mentioning, the move command in the recent versions of EAGLE has received some improvements. That's also going to make life easier when routing and when doing your layout. So I just really quickly want to highlight those. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you with the move command. Again, this is all going to be new to old users of older versions of EAGLE. This didn't exist before. The move command now has 3 modes. There's basically a preserve angles, there's free, and there's disconnect. So what preserve angles does is if I go ahead and grab this part right here and I move it, what you're going to notice is the angle of the traces, any traces that were at 45 degrees, that gets preserved. So it's not the free move that users from older versions of EAGLE are used to, where the traces would now go off in all sorts of weird angles and then you had to go back and clean that up. So you can see, even on something like this where you have a lot of traces going into the part, the angles are all preserved. If you do want to go free, like in the older versions of EAGLE, that is an option. You just pick the free mode and you select it and you start getting all the weird funky angles like in the old versions of EAGLE. That's obviously not desirable 90% of the time now, so you'll usually be on the preserve angles and that's what it defaults to. Now disconnect is interesting. Disconnect is something that can be really useful if you're going to have to swap out parts in your layout. What would often happen if you did a replace, or if you had to delete traces or make some sort of change like that, is that you would lose the routing. So using the disconnect option, that gives you the ability to preserve the routing. So I can go disconnect, I pick this one, and I take it over here, and you'll see that all this routing gets preserved. I can do anything to this part. I can delete it, I could do a replace, and all of that routing will be preserved. And then when I bring in the new part, I can just put it back over the preserved routing and save me that effort. So that's something, very quickly just wanted to highlight, that's something that you should be aware of that will make your life a lot easier when working, when routing out your boards. So let's go ahead and talk about the route command. There's a lot of options that we need to discuss now in the route command. So the first 3 icons are the main modes of the new route command. The first mode is full manual. So this is what you're used to if you used EAGLE previously. Okay, basically you can route over anything and everything. Now live DRC will tell you when you do that. So yes, I'm going all over the place. I can go anywhere I want. I can drop vias, and as I'm going and I'm crossing over things, you'll see that the live DRC is flagging errors.
Can you turn off the grid real quick?
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just turn off the grid to make that even more apparent. Okay, so let's do it again, and you'll see we get this. So this is full manual. In this mode, you can do whatever it is you want. There's no assistance in full manual. And just as a side note, if in any of the assisted modes you fall into a state of violation, for example, you started an assisted trace in a restricted area, what will happen is it'll default back to manual automatically. Okay? So this is the mode everyone's used to from previous versions of EAGLE. Now, walk around is a little bit more interesting. Walk around will follow DRC, so it won't run over any existing traces. It will observe the DRC minimums or net class minimums if they are defined. So as you can see here, I can go anywhere I want, but it's not going to short anything out. It's going to obey DRC. If there's any vias in the way, it's going to go around. Okay, so there's a bit more intelligence in this one. But as you can notice, it's not going to move anything to try to get through. It's going to run into the wall and stop there. The last of the new modes is now push obstacles. So actually let me undo these two segments. Now this one will actually start to move traces as long as they're not locked. If a trace is locked, then you will not be able to move it. Now one thing that you're going to notice is it's not going to move a via. Pre-existing vias can currently not be moved. Okay, so I can try to run into this all I want. The via is not going to move, but traces can be moved, as you can see here. Notice also that if I put a via on the end of the trace, then the via will adjust the traces as well. The traces will wrap around. So now when you see that yellow half circle, that's basically indicating a limit. It's basically at this point it can't push anymore. Could be that there's a via on the other side of a trace, or it's pushed as many as it can at that point in time. So
Hey George,
yep.
how are you invoking that via, please?
Yep, that's a good point. We should recap for the existing EAGLE users. So the via is being invoked using the space bar. So you don't have to do it with a space bar, but now that's a new feature, and I like the space bar. I find that it's very easy to invoke it that way. Those of you who have used EAGLE previously can continue to use the old method, which is basically to do the middle click, and I'll do that with this one now. So middle click, and I can bring it in, and you can keep going. Now, one other feature here that's good to mention since we're on it. While you're routing, if you hit the backspace key, you can start undoing segments. And you can go all the way back. So if you made a mistake, you went in a direction you decided you didn't want to go in, you can just backspace it. And that will work just fine. Okay, so just backspace, that'll work. So keeping that in mind, if you're routing, space will put in a via. And notice that it's not, again, for those of you who are coming from previous versions of EAGLE, in previous versions of EAGLE, what you would do is you would transition, and then after you left click the next segment, the via would be placed at the transition point. You'll notice that that's no longer the case in the newer versions of EAGLE. And the reason for this is pretty simple. Basically, if you do it the old way, you can't take into account the design rules and the net classes anymore. Because what ends up happening is, let's say you transition too close to an existing trace. Well, when the via gets put in, now the via is going to be in violation. And that's not acceptable. Also, for something like push and shove, you need to be able to determine the location of the via dynamically. It can't be an after the fact thing. So that's why now the routing engine in EAGLE places a via on the end, and the via is live. You can control where you want to place it. And that's something that's very different for those of you who are coming from a previous version of EAGLE. That will take a little bit of getting used to, but you'll notice that the benefits of being able to push and to walk around obstacles really outweigh that difference. And it's something you can very quickly get used to.
Jorge, how about if I have a layer stack up? How do I know what layer I'm going to go to?
So, in this case, this is a 2-layer board, but a couple of ways. If you do the middle mouse click option, then it's going to pop up the dialog and you pick what layer you want to go to next. If you do the spacebar will actually cycle. So if we look down here at the bottom of the screen, the second I hit the spacebar, it's going to say next layer bottom. So it's letting us know that if I left click now, I'm going to end up on the bottom. If you have 4 or 5 layers going on, then every time you hit spacebar, it will cycle through them and let you know, okay, now I'm at layer 2, now I'm at layer 3, now I'm at layer 15, now I'm at bottom. And you can keep cycling that way. If you have a huge layer stack up, like 10 layers for example, and you just go past the one you want, then holding down shift and hitting spacebar will rotate in the opposite direction. So it's very easy to go between layers doing it that way. Okay? So those are the main assisted modes. Okay? We have, just to recap, we have full manual, which is basically ignore obstacles. We have walk around, which will work its way around any existing obstacles, but it won't move anything. And then we have push obstacles, which will actually try to carve a way through any existing traces by shifting everything over. Now, one thing that we haven't discussed yet is the concept of single layer mode, which can be handy in dense boards. This one isn't particularly dense, but it'll still be useful. So if you
Before
notice,
you go there, Jorge,
Yes.
About the width, though, I mean, the trace width, I've been asked about the trace width.
Okay, so this width here is determined by the default DRC. Okay, so if we go into DRC, we go into sizes, minimum width is set to 6 here, but I bet you if we go to the net classes, it's going to be set to 8, and it is. Okay, so this brings us to a good point, and this example is actually a good example of something not to do.
Yeah, go a little slow here because it's extremely important that you
This is very
understand
importante.
where does your width get control when you're doing manual route. It can get a little confusing. That's why I wanted to bring this up before we went anywhere else.
So here's the deal. Basically, the net class and the design rules are always in competition with each other. The stricter of the two will win. So, what you always want to do is, if you notice, on any design, there's always one net class, at least one. And that's the default net class. Now, this person, whoever made this demo board, actually kind of broke convention. Our recommendation for the default class is to always leave it at 0 for everything. So, why? If you set width to 0, draw to 0, and clearance to 0, then it's obvious that whatever settings are in the DRC are going to be bigger than 0, and they're going to win out. So by setting the default net class to 0 on width, drill, and clearance, what you're doing is you're basically guaranteeing that by default, the DRC is in control. Okay? In this case, by the person adding these attributes here, they've now kind of overridden the DRC. So any changes I make in the DRC, unless they are larger than what's in the net class, will have no effect. So the key thing to remember here is, with the DRC and with the net classes, you are specifying a minimum. The larger of the two minimums will win. Okay? Now, while routing, okay, you can go ahead and change the width to something larger if you wish, or even something smaller. You'll just be in violation if you go smaller. Okay? So I could just type, and you'll notice the command line is active. You just type 12, for example, and now you have 12 mil trace. 15 mil trace, and go down to 6. Okay, but if I type 6, it's going to default to 8, because right now I'm in one of the assisted modes. If I go full manual, then I could do 6 if memory serves, yep, I could do 6 and be in violation. Okay?
As soon as you go to back to an assisted mode, it's going to bump it
It's
up.
going to bump it up. So the other thing to keep in mind here is that if you're constantly, let's say for example, you don't want to deal with net classes or you don't want to deal with DRC, okay, they're always in play. So if you start a new trace, it's automatically going to pick up that width. Now if you change it and you want to preserve the last stored value, then what you have to do is you have to go option set miscellaneous, and you basically make sure this is unchecked. If you have auto set route width and drill unchecked, then the last entered value will be preserved. We generally recommend working with net classes and the DRC, so generally you want to have this checked. Okay. Now one thing that we haven't discussed here is, like I was mentioning, the single layer mode and loop removal. Okay. Loop removal is super useful for cleaning up. Those of you who are coming from older versions of EAGLE, you're probably familiar to having to rip up a trace and then routing it again. Loop removal allows you to avoid that. So let's say, for example, that I want this trace to be straighter. I don't like the fact that I have this curve here. What I can do is anywhere on the trace, I can start a new trace, and as soon as I meet it, you'll see that the old one goes away. The loop is removed. And you can pick where it meets and all of that. Once you're happy with where it's at, just left click and you get the new trace. Okay? So that can make reworking traces very easy because you no longer have to go through these long rip up and reroute cycles. So definitely recommend to take full advantage of loop removal. It is on by default, so it will work. Keep in mind where it won't work. So if you have anything like where you have three traces connected, maybe at a V or something like that, then there's no defined loop there, so you won't be able to cut out part of it using this technique. But in single traces where you kind of just want to rework the trace, loop removal is your friend. Now, notice that we have an active layer. Active layer determines, number one, if we go into single layer mode, what layer is going to be focused. It also helps in selecting where you want to route. So for example, right now we have this top red and bottom blue kind of overlapping. Because I have layer 1 top being the preferred layer, if I just left click, you'll see that it starts routing there. Now, if I change it to bottom, you'll see that the order of rendering changed to let you know that, okay, bottom has preference now. And if I click on the blue one, or if I click even here, oh, I clicked too much on the red. Click on the bottom trace, you'll see that it makes it very easy to select the fact that it gets redrawn in that order. So visually it can be a little bit jarring if you're not used to it, but that's what this is doing here. It's basically defining a preferred layer to help guide the selection. And we can totally really see that if we go to single layer mode. You notice that everything else on the board will go gray, and you can really clearly see what's being routed. And if you middle click, you end up altering what layer is active. See, so we can switch bottom, top. While routing, let's say here I start routing. If I drop a via and then switch, you notice that the single layer mode automatically makes the change. So it can be really useful on dense designs to really clear up the clutter and make it easy to see what's going on. So I'll go ahead and take off single layer mode. Now, what are these remaining modes here? So these are what we call the quick route tools. And actually, before I go into them, those of you who are coming from previous versions of EAGLE will note that the routing mechanism, the route command, would only act on air wires before. But if you notice now, you can act on existing traces as well as air wires. So it's a lot more flexible and really allows you to get more done in less time. So now let's go to quick route.
Give me 1 second.
Yeah.
You know, so I had a question in regards of spacing. the rules on spacing, and you just demonstrated in regards of the width and how does net class or DRC, one of them leads the dance depending on which one is greater. I just wanted to make the comment that spacing is basically the same way. So DRC, you could set your spacing, but if there's a net class assigned to that signal, and that spacing is the one that's going to be affecting that signal instead. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure that you knew that as well.
Okay, so now let's go ahead and play with Quick Route. There's a couple of really useful tools in Quick Route, and actually the first one I'm going to show is a smooth signal command. So this one's really handy for cleaning up traces. What it wants to do is basically minimize the length and the number of bends. So for example, if I click this one here, you're going to notice that it's going to shorten up. Okay, basically just trying to minimize the bends on that segment.
It's a bit fast. I'm not sure if they could tell the difference.
Well, this is one example. I was going to go somewhere where it's a really obvious.
Okay.
So like over here, you see this one here. Okay, everyone look, magic. Okay, let's undo and redo so everybody can see it. Undo, redo, undo, redo. Now there's going to be traces where it's not going to do anything. It depends on the number of segments that are in the trace and things like that. But on many traces, it'll actually clean them up and try to straighten them out as much as it can. So it's really useful. I like using this functionality a lot. Now for the others, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to another board. One where it doesn't have as many things routed already, so it's easier to see what's going on. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. Nope. And these are really easy to see what they do by going into single-sided.
Before we finish today, somebody would like us to touch up a tad on meandering.
Okay. So we go over here, we click on route, and now we have these other options here. These are the other quick route tools. So the first one's very easy. It's just quick route and airwire. So we can click there, pick an airwire, it gets automatically routed. You just click and they get automatically routed. Pretty straightforward. Okay. Signal will try to route everything related to that signal. So it can get a little hairy. The quick route mechanism can only do a maximum of 16 air wires. So maybe this ground signal might not fly, but let's try it. And there it is. You see how it did the whole signal. Okay. So that's the difference. Airwire will do just one airwire, whereas Signal will try to do every single segment of that net. Okay, so that's the key difference. Now, this last one is very interesting, and I'm going to go ahead and rip up everything to show it. Okay, that's the new rip up command for those of you coming from older versions of EAGLE.
Can you do that one more time, because that was actually pretty nice.
So I'll do a Control Z to bring them back.
You will notice that when you do the rip up command on the action toolbar, now you get many options, including the fact that you could return all of your polygons to outline mode. You no longer have to invoke that by using a command line, which was in the past. So there's actually the last icon there on the action toolbar that allows you to return all of your polygons back to outline mode.
So basically these are different rip-up modes that allow more selectivity when doing the rip-up. So you can do all of the connected copper, you can do all of the connected coppers on the same layer, signal, between two components, you can just rip up everything or rip up polygons. So now there's an icon for the rip up polygons, as I was saying. The first mode is the old way. So usually when we enhance a command, the first option is the old way. So if you're coming from version 7.7, that's an easy thing to remember. Okay, this command that I'm very familiar with now has a whole bunch of options. If I don't want to learn that right now or deal with it right now, just pick the first one and it'll work the way it's used to. So with this one, like I said, I'll just rip up all the signals that ask me to say yes. And let's go back to the route. So the only option of route that we haven't covered that's new is quick route multiple air wires. Now this one's interesting. And the reason it's interesting is that it has a selection mechanism that no other command in EAGLE has. And that is a line selection mechanism. So for example, let's say I want to get all of these routed, all of this bottom route. Okay. What I can do is I can click here, and you'll notice it highlights the pads. And there's actually a little selection wire kind of coming off of. It's really hard to see. I don't know if you guys can see it, but it's a little thin gray wire. Everything that gray wire touches becomes selected. Okay? And you can see if I go around, it becomes like a little flashing display, you know?
Now, that's not a click and drag. That's just one click,
One-
and he's just moving it around.
Mm-hmm. So then when I reach the ones that I want, I just left click, and you'll see that all the air wires selected will highlight. And I didn't reach the end, but I can tack it on just by continuing to click. Now what's going to happen is once you're done, you just press enter. And then it will route everything as much as it can. In this case, it couldn't do it because I had this going on. Actually, it routed on the top there. It's not supposed to. Let me switch to bottom. Let's do that again. Hit enter. There we go. So it failed before because of the fact that it was on the top layer, and this is all covered in restrict. So this one's handy. It is kind of like an auto router, but you have more control over the auto router. You're selecting what specific signals are going to be routed, and the algorithm is a little bit more intelligent. It's really trying to minimize lengths, trying to route things in a way that it aesthetically makes more sense. So I think that covers everything.
Pleasure.
Bye, everybody.
Have a great day.